If you're seeing this video, you're either me in the future or you're someone who found me along the way of becoming the person that I envisioned myself at 28 years of age. And, in my current position, right now we don't have much as far as resources that we're working with, but what I do have is a breadth of experience and knowledge from the last several years of exploring, really like what I actually wanted out of life, but that took the form of entrepreneurship in many ways. Obviously, given our circumstances, we've made mistakes, we've had some good moments of momentum, but realistically, one of the core things that I realized was I had continuously found myself drifting off the path that I actually wanted to go on. 2022, I had a vision. I'd taken a bunch of mushrooms and I was in the forest and sat at a bench, and I decided to just think and see what came to me. And I had this vision of these city communities, I would say, more than like cities. People typically think of like skyscrapers and all of that. It wasn't necessarily that. There's a lot of stuff around it, but I envisioned myself as leading communities within these different populated areas, and we had agricultural centers, technology centers, and a heavy focus on blending science, medicine, agriculture, spirituality all together. And so this was in 2022, and I started thinking about, okay, like at first I didn't even realize what it was. I was like, is this a past life? Is this just like some dream type scenario that I'm thinking of? But the more and more over the years that I thought about it, the more I realized this was a future that I was heading towards. This was my future. So over the years, I started to think, all right, like if I want to have control to be able to build these types of communities and have the influence and the resources and the network, like what do I actually need to do? And so I started with exploring influencers. Actually, I was going to start an influencer media marketing agency. And here's a lesson that I learned fairly early on. Every reality that you can think of has happened because it's a unrealized potential. But you're only going to realize and actually live through the potential that you choose to, because every choice, I think you make every single choice that is ever possible to you. But your brain can only handle the reality that's in front of it. Like we're not consciously aware in the current state of humanity of like every decision that we've ever made. And so we hyper focus on the ones that we drive our attention to. But I think our consciousness is constantly splitting. So regardless, I had this concept of an influencer marketing agency, and I hit up one of my, I don't know if I want to call him a friend, associate, whatever, but he's somebody that I knew through work that I'd done. Good guy. I think he's got a solid head on his shoulders. He's making some good momentum this year. But I hit him up to start this marketing agency, and he was actually on board. And that was one of the really interesting things I noticed. Like I had friends that, I'd wanted to do business with, but, he was someone who I didn't really know all that well. And so you can find people that aren't necessarily your childhood best friend or like closest buddy, but they can understand the type of vision that you have for creating something. And so, long story short, the same summer I decided to drop out of college, and there was already other factors that were contributing to chaos in my house, but I guess that was kind of like the final straw to a degree. There was other things that kind of happened at the same time, but pretty much my parents were like, if you're not in college, then you need to figure out how to provide for yourself and go figure it out. So I ended up going to Miami, and this was the first time that I had gotten distracted from a business that was going to be mine Maybe not the first time, but I got distracted in the sense of like, instead of focusing in on doing every single action every day oriented towards that idea, instead I went and I got a job working with a guy that clearly did not have good moral compass, and I was there for way too long enough to get fired. So, that spanning maybe like a month and a half, I found myself kind of floundering, to a degree. Didn't really know like what was the best path to make sure that, being out in nature, you get all aspects of nature, including the bites. But I found myself trying to figure out like, what do I actually do right now to work on my goals, but also like put food on my table, make sure I can live, like really not die. But and so I ended up kind of bouncing around. I ended up going to Gainesville, and I start exploring opportunities within business acquisition. I'd already kind of been exposed to this, but when I got to Gainesville, I was like, all right, I had a psychic tell me I should look into landscaping. I start hearing about roll-ups and how this is being done in the landscaping space, and I'm like, okay, maybe there's something here for me. So I start working for a landscaping company, let my cards show too quick to certain people in the company that I wanted to buy it. So got fired from there, bounced around through a few different jobs, restaurant, Wawa. Eventually I started working for Vivint. Vivint was a really interesting experience because there's a lot of frat guys, which was like initially what turned me off to doing door-to-door, but in the circumstances I was in, I was like, I didn't see the potential that was in Gainesville. I think there was another timeline where I did, because I also was learning about AI and ChatGPT at that time. But after a few months of being there and not making as fast progress as I wanted, I was like, all right, how do I just get out of here? Maybe that was what I wanted to do, maybe it wasn't. Maybe I just heard people in my ear. Regardless though, worked for Vivint for a summer, learned some stuff. Overall, I'd say there was things I took away from the experience, but I found myself drifting further and further from the path that I wanted. Initially I had this vision of building cities, and instead of initially going directly towards how do I do that, I started thinking about influencer marketing. Then when things didn't work out in Miami and I decided to go to Gainesville, started looking at buying a landscaping company. When I got fired from that, then I looked at starting a microgreens business. And these were, they were still like entrepreneurial concepts. But then I started working for Vivint, and it's like, you can learn things within the company. I learned things about how to build a $1 billion company in a relatively short timeline. They started in like 1999. But found myself distracted in the sense that like, I had managers who, they want to just have everybody else become a manager so they can grow within the company. And, that's fine. Like, it's a great path for people who decide that's the path they want, but it wasn't the path I wanted. And I let myself stay in that company for too long. I initially should have just used that summer to pay for the things that I had started on that path for, and then just left. But I ended up staying there for almost another year. And not only did I not see the financial progression that I should have seen within being there for a year, and that's on me. I moved back with my parents when I came home instead of just taking a risk on myself and finding another place to live. But that's kind of interesting too, because living with your parents is strange, because like the benefit is you save money. The disadvantage is you stay in the same environment that you grew up around, which means you stay around people who still view you as the person you grew up as. And I don't really think that was the best thing for me. There are times where I would say it is better to stay there and leverage what you have to be able to move into a better position. But I don't know, everything's hindsight. Like, I could be a billionaire in 2 years, and then it's like, all right, well, it worked out anyways. Because there's lessons that you learn from every experience. So, I would say this as far as giving advice. I think that was one of the things that messed me up the most. Taking advice from people who weren't me. You are the only person who knows your actual situation. So why are you going to go to somebody who is going to have lived a completely separate existence, unaware of many of the factors that you take into account when making decisions, and then ask them for advice on goals they might not even understand? You are going to know where you want to go better than anybody else, except, higher power, your future self, however you want to look at that as. And so I don't really recommend asking people for advice unless it's like extremely specific advice about how they did something. That's really the only thing that I would recommend. I've gotten great wisdom from asking people about how they actually went about doing something and accomplishing something. But every time that I took advice from somebody else about a path that I should take, one of two things happened. Either I took that path and then I started questioning whether or not it even made sense because it came from somebody else who wasn't me, or I got other information that it influenced my thinking because, okay, this person's giving me this advice, and if I ignore it, what does that mean for our relationship? And long story short, I cared way too much about what people around me thought. That's one of the things too, like when you're trying to do something that nobody in your circle has ever done, they're gonna look at you like you're crazy. They're gonna look at the things that you're doing like you don't understand, like you're lost on your path, and at maybe some points, maybe you are. But it's better to figure out your own path than trying to ask people what the path is that you should take. Only ask people what they did from people who have achieved things similar to what you want to achieve. That is what I would really recommend on that. So long story short, I do Vivint. Stay there a bit too long. And the other downside to that was I waited to start on things that could have further progressed me on my goals. I didn't start a business until really 2025. I knocked a couple doors and washed some windows in December of 2024. But had I started that a year earlier, I would have had momentum carrying me into 2025, which I think would have been more lucrative, more profitable. But I've noticed the very beginning of the year really sets the tone for the year. 2024, I had a key decision, which was to pretty much stop smoking. And I decided to just keep buying pens. And I think that single decision messed up the remainder of that year. Because everything has a ripple effect. It's not like you make a decision and then it just disappears. If you look at reality like water, every decision is like dropping a pebble in the water. And so there's always going to be ripple effects that branch out from those decisions that you make. And so, long story short, that was another thing. I looked at somebody who I looked up to, and he was like, you should smoke. And I was like, well, I don't really feel great when I do this, and things haven't really changed for me in the last 4 or 5 years, but fuck it, he does it and he's successful. So I don't even know if cursing is something I really want to do. I'll leave this in here just because it's a genuine thing, but spelling is called spelling because it is literally casting spells. English is built extremely specifically. So if it's called cursing, why would you do it on a frequent basis? You know what I mean? But nonetheless, I kept smoking on an everyday basis. And the thing is about life is a lot of times it's about a middle path. It's not about overly to one side or overly to the other side, complete immersion versus complete isolation. It's a lot of times about a middle path. Every once in a while, I think it is okay to do certain things with the right intention, but everything has to be coordinated around intention, and that should be coordinated around a vision for who you want to be, what you want to do in this world, and just overall the impact that you want to have. So as far as 2024, I go into the summer, I don't finish the summer. Performance just dropped, and that was a lot due to the fact that I went into the summer having no money, and when you're a second year with Vivint, you don't have the same financial cushion they gave you in the beginning. So it was sometimes not eating at all, sometimes just eating a meal a day. I didn't really speak about my stuff. I mean, I don't know. To me, I thought it was clear enough that like I wasn't eating if I'm asking people for food, and like I'm visibly getting weaker and thinner. But like, regardless, I didn't ask outright. Maybe I should have. But long story short, I ended up going home, and as soon as I got home, I didn't have a vehicle, so that sucked. For about a year, you know, I'd ride to parks and started looking into real estate more, started exploring the entrepreneurial path, but I didn't really like revert back to the roots. And I wouldn't even say the roots, because like the root is building cities. But I started looking back at, you know, home service businesses, right? Acquisitions, because that was initially how I started down. And so I started a YouTube channel. I started recording videos on, you know, like a series of recording a video every day to achieve that path. And I got to maybe, I don't know, day 90 until it started not being as consistent, not doing, averaging one per day. Because sometimes, you know, it'd go past 12 a.m., but I'd still make up the video. But after a certain point, after like day 100 or day 110, at that point I had found a guy online teaching people how to build a window cleaning business. And my thought was, if I want to build a company that I help roll up home service industries, I could find nodes of networks through finding coaches and people who teach people how to build blue car businesses. Because at that point, they're all going to have the same systems, they're all going to be in the same industry, and they're already going to trust each other, which is like all three of those is like, you know, the challenge behind a roll up. So I knew going into things like I should be trying to find somebody who's on board with working towards that, but you know, this guy had certain skill sets around speaking that I was like, this would be valuable to learn. And so didn't really show an interest in the stuff that I was doing, but he was interested in obviously coaching me, and you know, that being something, because he was starting his program, and I ended up doing that. So it was cool because I went from having like a really crappy car, driving Uber, to making a few $1,000s my first few months. But the problem was, it's like that wasn't the goal, and like he knew the goal initially. And long story short, it didn't really work out too well between us. Ended up getting let go from the program, and I didn't have to pay the last payment that I had for it, which was a little bit over $1,000. It was like $1,250, but like it's not worth it, you know. Realistically, should have finished the program. And a lesson that I learned there was, regardless of whether or not people are doing you right or doing you dirty, you still have an obligation to yourself to do yourself right, right? And that means upholding not just your side of an agreement, regardless of whether the other person does or not, but it also means operating in a way that honors the people who have helped you, even if it wasn't in like your greatest intention. You know, never ever speak negatively or like with malicious intent about somebody who has helped you with making money, with your health, with any of that. Because you want to think of like everything that you get to experience as like a tree, and relationships are like the branches on the tree. So like if you have like a family, and let's say like your dad introduces you to people, and then they introduce you to people, if you start messing your relationship up with your dad, and then your dad's relationship is bad, then like all the relationships from that branch are also going to suffer and take hits, and they're not going to yield fruit. Fruit does not grow on dead branches. So always make sure that you foster strong relationships with the relationships that are important to you, and you don't speak negatively. You don't have any malicious intent. Like, I didn't even speak directly negatively, but I called out something that it was on him that, he was kind of ignoring me, but like regardless, it was on more than just my part for like everything in that situation. But I could have waited until it was just me and the mentor to say something about something in our agreement that I didn't feel was being met. So regardless, after all of this happens, my Windows business is still doing great, but like I started that year off And this was actually where I was going with this. I started that year off with having 3 main goals that I had in mind, which was build a home service company, build a real estate, like roll-up financing company, and then build my actual fund for buying the businesses that I wanted to buy. And so at the very beginning of the year, similar to 2024, I had a decision, which was to start the windows business. I kept hesitating on and putting off every day. And I ended up leaving the program before I started. And I ended up coming back, same agreement that we had started on. It was 2 weeks later, and it was after I already had mentally signaled to myself, when you make a decision, that's signaling something to your conscious mind and your subconscious mind. The subconscious being increasingly important. And so that threw me off. I guarantee that one decision for that year threw me off for the entire year. And the thing is like time and life, well, I think every decision branches into its own reality. Like, just like a river can split apart and then come back together. So I think most of like the canon events for your life, it's almost like a wave, and these waves intersect, but like, are you gonna like keep bouncing off that intersection into the deep end, or are you gonna actually like make sure you come up on some of those waves, and ride the wave sometimes, so you can just keep it ascending. So all this just to say, that decision messed me up, but I still ended up pursuing those 3 goals. April came around, started, I went to an influencers event in Miami, and I got distracted by all these people claiming they're doing so well in business. That's one of the things about Miami. Miami is very active, but when it comes to like moving out of your parents' house, people are going to say, go to the big city, go to where all the action's happening. But honestly, I think that's probably one of the worst things you should do. Like, when you're trying to move yourself out of an environment that has cultivated a version of yourself that is not conducive with the reality that you want, why would you go to a noisy environment with a bunch of people who are saying and claiming and doing all these other things that you don't even know if it's right for you? The best thing you can do is get to a place where it's quiet, where you can hear your inner voice and know what you want for yourself rather than what everybody around you is saying what you should be going after. So, long story short, I go to Miami and I start working on this real estate company. I left all my window cleaning equipment behind. I was getting referrals like almost every other day too, for a few weeks after I'd left. So I kept thinking about the windows business, but stayed in Miami, and I started working on building the platform for the real estate company, the real estate roll-up financing company, because it was pretty interesting. It was going to be a flywheel effect where we grouped together projects to raise capital for them in like a portfolio, and that way, we could put together like 10 projects that are worth 1 to 10 mil, and then raise like a $50 million package. Right when I was like starting to feel like it was time to move forward with that, there was a few things that happened. One was I had a family member ask me about working on the windows business after they had opportunities well before, when that was my main focus, and me wanting to work with my family, like I decided to start trying to integrate them into what I was doing. That added unnecessary pressure that I didn't need. Like, when you give somebody an initial opportunity, let them take the initial opportunity, but if they come back to you after opportunities pass, you don't need to reorient what you're doing to try to cater to them. You don't need to introduce them to a new opportunity after they showed you they had no interest in helping you before you had visible momentum. And so, I wanted to work with the family. I've always wanted to be close with my family. Unfortunately, my family has been closest with me when I've been doing super well, and it's very opposite when I'm not doing all that well. So, long story short, I ended up starting to integrate him into doing some of the stuff that I was working on, but it was unnecessary pressure. Figure out all your components first, and work with people who, again, like, you should be trying to find people, you should be building a network, but only work with people who can see your vision for what it is and are on board from the start of the vision before anything is visible elsewhere. Looking back, that's what I would have done. The other problem was I started getting antsy about money because I'm thinking, all right, my money's gone. I got scammed before moving. I made a bad investment decision. So my money's gone. I need money in the door to cover my expenses. And then I have this other person who's working with me that is working with me because he needs money. So I start thinking about how to actually make money rather than building the actual platform the way it should have been built. And I start looking to work with people off of LinkedIn. And LinkedIn, like, I don't know, maybe there's great stuff that can happen on LinkedIn, but from what I noticed, it's kind of like Instagram. You have like 5% of people who are actually leveraging it for business and like utilizing it to its fullest potential. And then you have just like a bunch of people who are slop consumers and people who are like kind of dabbling, but like they're not really serious. LinkedIn, like, I'm sure there's great professionals, but was looking for people to work for, and unfortunately I had some dude who claimed he had some family office with millions that he needed to access from these insurance notes, but he couldn't even pay me a few $1,000s for building the smart contracts that I spent maybe like, I don't know, easily over 80 hours between smart contracts and talking with him on the phone and doing all this consultant work. Didn't get paid for none of it. And not only did I not get paid what I wanted to use as like a cushion for building my own platform, I wasted precious time that should have been going towards my stuff and my platform. So, you know, lesson there, forget everybody else's business plans, all that type of stuff. When you know what you want and it's time to work on your own goals, let them figure it out. If it aligns with what you're already doing, great. But don't start taking away the energy from your stuff out of the sake of trying to make some money fast. Realistically, it would have been like a month till I got evicted. I could have figured out other ways to get food, so I shouldn't have worked with that dude. POS and and like, you know, if realistically, like, I should have vetted him more thoroughly in the beginning. Like, pay me right now, you know, even if it's just $500, $1,000, and then I'll do the work and you can give me the rest at the end. Long story short, that threw me off. I started going back and forth between Miami and Tampa to clean windows, work on the idea, and that division of attention kind of crushed both things for me. I ended up going back to Tampa for a significant period to like try to pay for my apartment, which I ended up doing so my first month back, but I had like nothing left over. And I was like, all right, you know, at this point my equipment keeps breaking. Should I keep focusing on this or should I just go after goal number 3 for the year? I decided to go after goal number 3. So I ended up going back to Miami, ended up trying to work with a guy who I didn't even trust in the first interaction I had with him. There was just weird stuff, you know, he's like a likable guy, but like there was things that was weird that I didn't trust, and instead of just going with my gut and like not working with him, I was like, let me just figure out whether or not he's somebody I can trust and I don't understand, or if I actually don't trust him because he is who I have a hunch he is. Long story short, you know, opportunity I had that could have financed me getting to a very important event that I had for that year. I was going to speak at Malta, got invited to a conference. I didn't even get to go because I didn't have the plane ticket booked. Super unfortunate. Probably would have made millions from the connections there. And it was because of this dude that, you know, be careful with who you tell about the things that are working in your favor. Because this dude, me and him, you know, both wanted to work with this one guy who's in Miami that we respected. And I had an opportunity to make a couple $100 a day working with this dude, doing something very easy. But I tell this guy that I don't even really trust about this. And then I also tell him about the other thing that was offered to me, which was something in the realm of social media marketing. And that's what this dude does. That's what this dude wanted to do for this guy that we both knew. And so I ended up going back home to my, you know, parents for my birthday. And while I'm there, this dude goes, meets up with this guy, gets the $200 a day job that was for me, And then when I end up coming back, he also ends up getting the social media marketing thing after all three of us meet. And I'm sitting there, and like the whole time I'm just like, I don't trust this guy, but do I say something right now? And the guy that we both wanted to work for, I don't know what he interpreted from the situation, but what he said was that I didn't seem confident, and he offered the other thing to the guy. And I wasn't gonna get paid enough in time for my Malta trip just based off of that alone. I needed this $200 a day job. So I was kind of like taken for words, like I didn't have any words to even say them. So he ends up getting it and gave him way too much leverage over me. You know, after I stopped paying for my apartment situation was kind of shit. It wasn't great. This guy offers to let me stay at his place. Shouldn't have done that, because like I already don't trust him. He's already taken away stuff that would have financed me getting to the one trip that mattered for me for this third, honestly for two goals. You know, it would have given me the connections for the real estate stuff. It could have led to the connections for the fund. Long story short, I stay there, and that was a mess. After a couple of weeks, there was a timeline that was given to us as far as like when things would be restructured within this initial opportunity that was around the social media marketing. And after that timeline went, so did the respect in that living situation. So I ended up getting out of there after a month and a half of escalations. Things got pretty intense, and I got to a point where I knew I was going to lose control of this guy. So I was like, you know what? Let me get out of here before we both end up, you know, in a not so great situation. So I moved to Sunny Isles for like a month and a half. Or maybe like a month. I was there in an Airbnb with this older Russian lady, and she had a bedroom that she needed to rent. And during this whole time of me living with this guy from the marketing agency and living in Sunny Isles, I started working with a guy who was introduced to me through another guy that I didn't trust. But you know, he's like in the realm of private equity, and I was like, all right, great. Like, this is the connection that I was looking for, I thought. So I worked with him. I helped him set up an event for entrepreneurs who are looking for funding, and that didn't really work out too well. You know, I wasn't eating, I was dealing with a crazy living situation, no car. You know, I was homeless for like a good week and a half or so, literally having to work in like alleyways and basements and at Chipotle tables at like 4 a.m. at night. So all this stuff was kind of happening, and he knew it, but like he had a lot of other people in his ear. I think he's himself is a quality guy, but he had people in his ear who did not have my best intention. And so long story short, after the event, I ended up having to go home because it's like I'm literally sleeping on the street, or was about to. But I ended up coming back to Tampa, and I felt like I did not feel great because I was around my dad, who my dad has always had opinions about entrepreneurship and sales and pretty much everything that I've tried to do on my own path. And then I'm around all my siblings who, like, I talked about numerology and astrology all the time, and I was like, 2025 should be a great year for me. And then I'm around them for Christmas, and like, it wasn't anything that they said directly to me, it was what they did say and what they didn't do. Like, there was not a sense of like being glad to see my brother, and albeit, you know, I had mistakes throughout the year that kind of dampened my relationships with the siblings, but I could tell there was like this, I don't even know if disappointment is a word for it, but like fraudulent vibes around like what they thought of me. Like, this was supposed to be your year, and well, what have you have? So all that energy, like, you know, it kind of hit me, and I was not in a good headspace for December. Didn't really want to do anything. Ended up staying home for most of that month. And I remember after working with my dad on a project, I was cleaning some windows for a house he was working on. There was this land that I drove past. It was 80 acres on Lake Fern. This was a place that I knew had there was some sort of connection I had to this land. Look into the land a bit more, I come to find out it had equestrian trails on it, and The Christmas prior, my cat died. First pet that I'd had for pretty much its entire life, and it's probably the closest living thing I was closest with. Like, I'd spent so much time with this cat, especially after I came home from Vivint, more time that I spent with the person. So I remember it really hit me when the cat passed away, because even though my understanding at the time was death happens, I didn't have anything worth being I just knew I wasn't in a position where I could give my family what I wanted to give them. Even however things were over the years, I always knew I wanted to be able to do certain things with my family. And so a Christmas later, nothing to show for it the whole year, on a physical exterior world sense, and found that land. I just remember feeling really bad during that season, and it showed. It's not a great place. So at this point, January, I start to Uber a bit. I keep thinking about the windows business. Whole year I've been thinking about the windows business, because I thought, if I'd done that properly, maybe things would have worked out. Again, everything came back to that first decision in the beginning of the year. But I realized 2026, it's a new year. It's a new January. I need to make a new decision that actually defines how the rest of this year goes. So the decision oriented around that land. I decided I was going to buy that land. I decided I was going to build companies that would allow me to build groups of men. And saying that out loud, those are the two components I need to work on: the land, the women, and the men. But very focused on that land. So February comes, still Ubering a little bit, end up meeting a smoking girl I end up going on a date with. And long story short, I had some dudes playing soccer that we ended up going out to play with them. I got showed up, and I got I'm still learning the whole social cues things, and men are real interesting, because around women, they'll even around other men, they'll try to bitch you out without directly being disrespectful. It's a weird thing. Not every man does it. I don't think men do it, boys do it. But regardless, it's something that I need to learn how to actually handle for future situations. Regardless, though, this girl ends up staying with those guys instead of, ending the date properly. So first date, whatever, but bruh, I was so angry. And I hadn't been angry in a long time. I got really angry when I was staying with that guy, and he said something that ended up leading to me leaving. Because I put up with a lot of stuff beforehand. But this time was different, because I was angry more so at myself, because this was a result of me not being the man that I was supposed to be. And to a degree you can say everything is like that, but this especially. So I remember, it wasn't much, but I did 100 push-ups that night. And I let myself sit with that anger, because instead of feeling defeated and sad, I felt angry, which felt better than feeling disappointed. But that was good, because it was a catalyst that over the coming next week and a half, it reawoke this fire inside of me to go after what I wanted and be unapologetically myself. And so going forward into the year, that fire burned within me bright for the first month, and I let myself have it be dampened by an individual who started to learn about physical health, because I decided I wanted a trainer in the gym. That's again my mistake. I think me, especially with the person that I am, not everybody is like this, but sometimes you don't need a mentor. Sometimes you are capable of taking yourself to exactly where you want to go. And an advisory board can be very beneficial, but a mentor, somebody who's above you and giving you this whole grasshopper sensei type treatment, that's I don't need all that. I'll take some advisors, I'll surround myself with people who have what I want, but I don't need people talking down to me I just don't need it. So long story short, being around that individual, did I learn some things about health? Yeah. But introducing him to my business was a role that he wasn't supposed to be part of. He wasn't supposed to be one of my cleaners. He wasn't supposed to be one of my starting men. We talked about him potentially being a trainer, but he was super disrespectful after I brought him out. Screamed at me in the car, cursed me out, and threatened to come home to my house that I brought him to cause a disturbance if I dropped him off on the road. So that dude's where he's at for a reason, and it's unfortunate because I actually genuinely enjoyed his company, and he's extremely gifted in the spiritual sense as a teacher, but he's got to control himself. You can't be teaching things that you don't live by. That's something that I'm learning for myself anyways. And so, long story short, that disrupted the frequency that I had aligned myself on in early March. And that is one of the things that I've came to learn and realize over the years, is that you go through cycles of life and death. And death is not about dying in your physical body. That's something different. And by the time you get there, you should have died many times over to become the person that you want to actually be. But regardless, whether you're looking at numerology, whether you're looking at the 4 horsemen, whether you're looking at yin and yang, there are cycles of, creation and destruction. And so over these last several months, I have gone through a new cycle. And I'm at the start of a new one. And I've realized I have found myself increasingly distracted by things that are not truly aligned with what I want. What I want is to build cities. I want men and women around me for sure. But building a city, if you build a city, it's a lot easier to build men and women around that versus trying to build all the men and women and then build the city. I need to start with my central role and let everything else permeate from it. And so, cities, am I going to build Miami tomorrow? I don't need to. What I do need is to start cultivating the network and that advisory board, that council, that circle around who I want to actually do that with. So I've got a project now that I'm working on. Lake Fern is a very key piece of it, but we're also looking at an island on Lake Griffin. We're looking at uniting various locations through seaports using the Icon A5s. These are a seaplane, very nice, and I think luxury aviation ports can be utilized by prominent businessmen in Florida, not just as a means of getting around for themselves, but a means of bringing them to the centers that we cultivate for them. And so I think if we craft these private locations towards the people that we want to build these communities with and these cities with, then have a very cool place that we can bring together the builders, the architects, the land developers, the governmental legislators, all those people can come together at these places. And I think if we start there, we put ourselves in a very good position. So this has been a bit of background on where I've came from, where the true goal is, true north, and just kind of an intro, I guess, into what we're going to start building. So hopefully all this is recorded. If not, I guess it's good practice for speaking. But with that being said, I'll see you guys on the next video. Peace. Oh, look at that.